Hello everybody, it's Foxy speaking, and I wanted to give a special video on the, it's a very belated video. This should have been done actually, just over a month short ago, in very late January of this year, 2021. Because the 27th of January, 2021, marked what would have been Holocaust Memorial Day, but the in-person event actually didn't go ahead this year because of COVID and the vaccination program going on. But the 27th of January 2021 was Holocaust Memorial Day, a day which all should remember. And well, certainly do I think it's a vitally important day to remember. Yes, it's a very vitally important day to remember. Remembering all the innocent lives lost during the terrible oppression of the Holocaust in Auschwitz in Poland, which was... it was just indescribably brutal, terribly awful, the Holocaust, just terribly awful. It was absurd. It was totally absurd, the Holocaust. Awful. What the Nazis did in the Holocaust. Sorry if there are any elderly German OAPs or elderly German citizens watching, but what the Nazis did was awful, and I'm sure many of them would agree as much as I think so. No, but and if you didn't know, last year, 27th of January 2020, marked the 75th anniversary of the Holocaust Memorial Day, and in honour of the some Holocaust survivors who are actually still alive. Well, there are very few Holocaust survivors from that era who are still living and surviving as of 2021. There was one prominent Holocaust survivor who very sadly died in 2019. Were just days after he was interviewed, and that was Harry Bibring from Austria. Having been expelled from his school because he was Jewish, and then himself and his sister and his parents were sent to Holocaust, whom his father had a business, but sadly that got destroyed and smashed up and crashed about, because he was Jew, because the revelation came to the fact that his parents were Jewish, so his father's business got smashed up and bashed and battered, quite wrongly by the very wrongly, in fact, by the Nazis, and he lost both his parents to the Holocaust, only whom he and his sister survived, along with a few others, but I don't know how many others survived when he was in, and I very much know, and then he and his sister moved over to England, not speaking a word of English, but eventually he learned English over time, after meeting this nice young lady, Muriel, who happened to be Harry's future wife. He managed to learn English via her, and then before long, Harry Bibring himself was speaking English just fluently. He was fluently speaking English before he knew it, after not speaking a word of English when he arrived into England in the United Kingdom. He and Muriel subsequently got married 2 years after they met, in 1947. And he had children, and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but sadly Muriel died some years before he did, and then he very sadly died over the many years he lived. But he was very fluent in English, actually, and even, well, I mean, even in his adult years and certainly into the latter 20 years of his life, he had a very proper British accent, despite being originally Austrian. He had a very British accent for an Austrian man, because of course he'd lived in England from 1945 at that point, and he never went back to Austria once he moved over to England. And his wife, his older sister, 2 years his senior, subsequently moved over to America in the 1950s. But unfortunately, his sister, Gerta, very sadly died. I think it was Gertrude, I think his sister was. But Gertrude very sadly died in 2001, aged 78, which was very, very sad. I mean, she went which was years and years before Harry died, because Harry sadly died in 2019, aged 93, if you didn't know. But over the many years before Harry's death, he did many talks about the Holocaust over many years to schools, colleges, Holocaust events, what have you. He did it, and he was even interviewed just 4 days shy before his death. He didn't die of any illness or anything. He just died. He died in good health. He didn't die of any diseases or anything, but very, very sadly, Harry Bibbring died on the 31st of January 2019, aged 93. He didn't die of any illnesses. He wasn't terribly ill or extremely sick or anything when he died. He actually died healthy, but he had a good innings. It was really sad, his death. Well, his passing was very sad, obviously, but what was most relieving was that he didn't die in painful death. He went in good health, happily asleep, obviously now not waking up, but having a good, pain-free sleep, and his legacy will just be with us forever, Harry Bibring's. And he will always be a prominent former Holocaust survivor. Yes. And who is next? Oh, yes. Then the next one, another very prominent, but Harry Bibbring was not on Wikipedia, by the way. He never had a Wikipedia page. But this very next prominent Holocaust survivor, also he does not have a Wikipedia page either, is Ivor Pearl, a former Hungarian Holocaust survivor, who was born in Hungary to a family of 8 siblings and 2 children, a Hungarian Jewish family that spoke Yiddish in a specific religion. It was a Yiddish speaking religion where he was raised and brought up in Hungary, of course. But yes, and he had a very he was brought up very, very religiously. Ivor Pearl was, and following several religious Jewish traditions. But yes, but over many years, it was into his childhood. In 1944, when Ivor Pearl was just 12 years of age, 12 years and a few months, because he was born in February of 1932. Well, he was born on 4th of February 1932, and this was around about spring-summer of 1944. Hungary was just invaded. It was just ravaged. It it was just invaded, ravaging with awful enemy Nazis. And within like 2 weeks, all Jewish Hungarian citizens were just sent to Auschwitz immediately. Within 2 weeks after the Nazi invasion. Well, the evil Nazi invasion, more likely. And he was travelling off from Hungary to Auschwitz in a cattle truck on a train along with several other Jewish people. Although, despite the crammed conditions and the trip, he was like, "Oh, this is fun. I've never been on a train ride before." Well, he was only a boy at that point, although people would have thought he was a teenager. But because well, it's something I'll get later on. But once he arrived in Auschwitz, along with his parents and his siblings, because he was in a family of 8 siblings, and of course his parents. But upon arriving in Auschwitz, his parents were going to be sent to the gas chamber. Ghastly. And his mother was like, go to your brother. And then either, only a very young boy at this point, he was like, I want to come with you, Mum. And she's like, oh no, Ivor, you cannot come. And he was like, please, Mum, I just want to come with you. And she's like, no, Ivor, just go back to your brother. So very, very sadly and solemnly, Ivor did. And that was the last he had ever saw of his parents. But then he did manage to see one of his sisters just before he went in. He was like, look, I'm an adult now. I'm wearing long trousers. But then that was the very last he saw of his sister. But when he was stood beside the German guard, he didn't know what the German was talking about because the German guard spoke a totally different language to what he did. And but this person in German, the Auschwitz guard in German, asked Ivor, how old are you? And because Ivor was big for his age, he was only 12 at that point, he automatically, in Yiddish Hungarian, he automatically said, I'm 16 years old. So, after saying that he was 16 years old, well, the German didn't know what he was talking about, so he just pointed him to go, which was actually away from the gas chamber. And when he was in the Holocaust, he remembered all these guards shouting in Yiddish, eat all the food, don't save any food, because they were taught to hoard the food. He and all the other Holocaust people in the Holocaust, they just didn't know what was going to happen to them. They were hoarding the food as vastly as they could. It was just so unknown, and there was he remembered a great deal of commotion going on in the Holocaust. Yes, and then before long in the Holocaust, his group were going to be taken to the gas chamber. His parents had already been gassed and murdered, and his siblings, except for his brother, because it was one night he was asleep, and there were all other children in there with him. It was very quiet, and in a sneaky way, in fact, his brother was like, Ivor, you've got to come out. He was like, no, I can't come out, I'm scared. He's like, no, you've got to come out. He's like, no, I'm not going to come out, I'm scared, I'm really scared. But his brother kindly lost patience and eventually dragged Ivor out of the shed, and then they were outside, and they just stood out there waiting until the morning arose. Once the sun had fully risen, they peeped inside the shed, and basically the whole shed was just empty. All the children were taken to the gas chambers. He and his brother very, very vividly remembered it. Before long, it was 1945, but he said that he didn't think about the Holocaust, he just carried on with it, but he could understand. He really was a man who wisely understood how awful the Holocaust really, really was, you know, honestly. It's just beyond unbearable. It's ghastly. The Holocaust. Absolutely ghastly. It's deadly. Before long, it was 1945 and liberation. Liberating the last of the surviving Jewish Holocaust survivors and all the Nazis being arrested. And he and his brother were offered a flight to England. And once he and his brother were offered the trip to England, and once upon arriving in England, Ivor felt, he literally felt he had arrived in heaven. He felt like he enormously felt a great deal of happiness, of life, and of love, because he literally thought England, arriving in England, was arriving in heaven. But unfortunately, he and his brother did not speak a word of English when they arrived. But when they arrived in England, they eventually learnt to speak English, which they eventually got the good hang of. Over the many years that Ivor lived, in about 1950 it was, when he was about 18 he was 18 at the time. He went to a party with his brother and a few friends of his, and I think it was either his brother Alec or his friends, or one of his friends, who said, Ivor, would you like to meet a nice young girl? The reason why it was just his brother, because all his other siblings and his parents were gassed and murdered in Auschwitz in the Holocaust. But either it was his brother Alec or his friends who said, Ivor, would you like to meet a nice young girl? And that was when he met his wife. His wonderful wife's name was Rhoda. And then they subsequently, after meeting, they just fell for each other. They eventually got married in 1953. They had 4 children, and he lived life working as a businessman, a viable businessman. He and his wife Rhoda had 4 children, then over time 6 grandchildren, and then he subsequently retired sometime. I'm guessing when he was in his 60s, I should think. But then very sadly, over the many years, it's certainly after his retirement, his brother Alec died from cancer only in his 70s, very, very sadly. So, and he's now making him the last surviving sibling out of his other siblings who were murdered during the Holocaust, including his parents, and his brother who went of cancer several years later. But he did many talks for the Holocaust, and he has done even last year and not too long ago. But then, over some years, his wife Rhoda got dementia, which was very, very sad. It was around about the time of their 60th wedding anniversary, Rhoda got dementia. Awful. And subsequently, Rhoda died within a few years. She died, sadly, in 2016 to dementia. She was in her 80s. But this affected Ivor deeply. And also his children and his grandchildren. But despite that, this never stopped him from making talks to the Holocaust or attending a Holocaust centre. It was some years before Rhoda died, or I'm guessing it was just after Rhoda died, I think. His children said to him, "Why don't you go to the Holocaust centre?" And so he went along there, and honestly, and you would be amazed to hear this, when he arrived there, he felt like a tremendous weight lifted off his shoulders. And then he stated, in 2018, he stated, throughout his life, he'd been respected. Things had happened to him for one reason. He believed things were happening to him for one reason, and one reason only, stating because he was Jewish. And having gone through the worst, he also ended up stating that he had gone through and also seen and had the most loving care humanity could have ever given him, because he was Jewish. Well, Ivor Pearl himself described going to the Holocaust Centre as being more of a first home to him rather than a second home for him. He described not only did it enrich his life, but it also gave him a much more broader outlook to life and a big new lease of life. He ended up describing it as what you call, it's like a new life. And this is something I will never ever forget. What he said: throughout my life, things have happened to me for one reason and one reason only, because I'm Jewish. Ivor Pearl stating this back in 2018. And he did do talk on Holocaust Memorial Day 2020, and he himself even visited Auschwitz, if you didn't know. Ivor Pearl very much did. But yes, and I'm hoping for the best. I should think he'd already received his first dosage of his COVID vaccine, since because he's still very much alive, if you didn't know. He's not passed away. Harry Bibbring is the one who sadly passed away, but not Ivor Pearl, who's very, very much alive, because he's now 89 years of age. Still lives in his own home, despite the loss of his wife Rhoda in 2016. But, yes, he's got his children, his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, very much so. He's got 2 great-grandchildren, 6 grandchildren, 4 children, as said before. And there's not only Ivor Pearl, there are a few other Holocaust survivors out there, but I don't know if they're as prominent or as notable as he is. Because I mean, the main reason for this is because Holocaust Memorial Day is a vital day to remember. The Holocaust is just so awful, but it's important that future generations know about this. It really has to be, its legacy should not stop. Its legacy needs to be brought forward. The Holocaust legacy. And especially because there are fewer Holocaust survivors out there, it's absolutely vital that many research teams get as much information as they can from whatever Holocaust survivor there is, so that it's not lost, so it certainly is not lost forever, and so that its legacy can just continue for a lifelong lifetime, lingering into the future. Holocaust Memorial Day, it's not a hoaxing game, it's a vital and important day to remember, remembering all the Holocaust survivors who had suffered so much during the Holocaust, which was just, I mean, it must have been just frightening, as well as absolutely ghastly and dreadful. It's so awful, but I feel it's right many people, and certainly oneself, learns about it. Thank you all very, very much for watching. I'm dreadfully sorry, but it's quite important, this one. I'm so sorry I didn't even do it on the day Holocaust Memorial Day usually takes place. It's usually on the 27th of January every single year. Thank you so much indeed for watching, and I shall certainly see you in the very next video. Bye-bye, everybody. Another time. From your friend Foxy.